My project is about the consequences of extreme events on natural populations using a marble trout as my model system. Extreme events are characterized by rarity and severity. They happen once in a while, they are typically unpredictable, but they have a massive consequences on natural population, often inducing massive mortalities. I think it's the right time, and I will try to convince you of that, for ambitious interdisciplinary research project with the goal of developing new tools, new methods, and new angles to tackle the challenge represented by the effects of extreme events on natural populations. So this is my model system is marble trout, is a fish living only in fresh water, and is closely related to the more popular brown trout. Nowadays, marble trout live only in Slovenia. Slovenia is a small country in Central Europe, about the size of New Jersey, with more or less 1/4 of the population of New Jersey. And nowadays, just a few populations are alive in the world of pure population of marble trout, and each of the population alive right now are represented by the gray dot in the figure. They all live pretty close to the border with Italy, and also marble trout is of economic interest because a lot of fly fishing enthusiasts are spending millions of dollars to fish marble trout during, especially the fall season. Marble trout live in unpolluted mountain streams, but up to a few years ago, the status of the population the species was largely unknown. So a conservation project started, and the first thing that you do when you've got to decide what the status of the species is, you go out to the field, you count the fish, you measure them, and if you've got time and money, you can also take a small tissue from each fish for later DNA analysis. So that's actually what we did. We went out, electrofishing the fish, measuring them, counting them, to have an idea of the status of the species. So let's have a look at some of this population. Here in the graph, the horizontal line is representing the risk of extinction. If you are above them, the population is safe. If you go below the horizontal line, that means that there is an immediate risk of extinction. So this population was doing all right, as you can see from the figure, but at a certain point, we observed a collapse in population size. So the population went from a safe size to being at immediate risk of extinction. Let's have a look at another population. This one, despite some up and downs, was doing pretty good. But yeah, in 2007, we observed another collapse. So from same size to risk of extinction, and two populations were almost lost. Now, let's have a look at another population. Now, probably you know the trick right now. The population was safe size, but at a certain point, we observed a collapse. So what was the cause of these massive mortalities? Now, you need to know that marble trout live in peaceful and mellow streams that sometimes are neither mellow nor peaceful. In fact, flash floods are occurring in a steady area, causing great damages to human infrastructure, but also by killing and displacing fish. So flash floods are not the normal floods that we observe regularly. That means that the time scale is completely different. The rising of waters doesn't happen in days, but just in a matter of a few hours. They are incredibly destructive because they move huge amounts of water along with debris and rocks that basically kill by smashing the fish. This is actually not surprising that flash floods are occurring in Slovenia. Slovenia is the western region in Europe, and the habitat where marble trout live receive more than double the average rainfall in Slovenia. This, combined with the particular topography of the territory with narrow and steep valley, contribute to the formation of these destructive, extreme catastrophic events. Now, you might be curious at this point what happened to those populations. Well, the fate was different. The red population went extinct. The orange population was able to bounce back, pretty surprising to safe population level. And the third one, the blue one, is pretty much unknown right now. The status of the population is probably recovering, but we will discover that in the next few years. Now, what they experienced is basically called the population bottleneck in ecology and evolutionary biology. And I will give you a simple illustration of the population bottleneck. It happens that every individual is a different marble represented on the right, and then at a certain point there is an environmental event, extreme typically, and unpredictable, like for example an earthquake, a flood, a drought, or a wildfire, and with demographic and genetic consequences. Demographic consequences because we got a reduction in population size, just a few individuals are able to pass through the bottleneck. And genetic consequences because you need to think that genetic diversity scales with population size. So if you reduce the population size, what's happening is also reduce genetic diversity. Now, some individuals maybe are able to pass through the bottleneck, but if these individuals are not the most fit in the population or not able to reproduce successfully, what happens is that the extinction is almost inevitable. But in other cases, some individuals are able to pass through and to reproduce successfully. And so they're able to reform the population in just a few years. Now, the thing is that who's passing through, and does it matter? And are the traits allowing individual to pass through the bottleneck the same traits allowing them to reproduce successfully after? This is one of the core questions of my research project. But first, I want to spend a few minutes thinking about extreme events. Are extreme events characterizing the population dynamics of certain species, or are a more general threat or determinant of population dynamics at a global scale? And are there any adaptations in terms of responses to extreme events that we observe in the natural world? Well, let's start with a description of extreme events. You probably noticed or observed that the world is becoming more extreme. And there's a consensus about climate scientists that this is due to climate change, or even better, that the fact that extreme events are becoming more common is one of the most dramatic consequences of extreme events. In particular, two classes of events are predicted to increase. One is higher temperature and drought and wildfire, and the other one are episodes of more intense rainfall with associated flood events. Let's give a few examples of extreme events you're probably familiar with. This one is about the 2014 northeastern US cold wave, and we're experiencing that right now. It's quite chilly in New York. What happened is that an Arctic cold front tracked across the United States and Canada, bringing low temperature, using snowfall, and also a bunch of problems, like, for example, the closure of school, businesses, federal offices, and also mass flight cancellations. Low temperature records were broken across the United States, even in Florida. And you can see from the figure here of the Lake Michigan, more than 90% of the lake was frozen, a peak that has been reached just a few times in the last 50 years. Let's move to the other side of the United States, to the West Coast, and we've got another extreme event right now, 2014 California drought. As you can see from the figure, the difference is pretty striking between 2013 and 2014. There was a lot of snow in 2013, but in 2014, basically no snow. That snow is important also for food production. In fact, it's in part feeding one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world, the California Central Valley. So we got food problems for the United States, but in general for the world, and also problems related to water scarcity, and Governor Brown declared a state of emergency a few months ago just to try to face the consequences of the drought. But you also have to consider that this is the third year of the drought in California, and is becoming a problem. This probably will get even worse in the next year. Now, extreme events are not happening just in the United States. We can also move to Europe. And one of the most dramatic extreme events happening in Europe are floods, especially in Central Europe. Now, I consider the 2013-2014 floods, but actually could have considered every flood happening in the last 10 years. These were considered century floods. That means floods with a recurrence interval of 100 years on average, but they're happening every 3 or 4 years, so the statistics need to be updated pretty soon because the world is changing real fast. In the figure, you can see the city of Passau, Lower Bavaria in Germany, that experienced in the June 2013 the worst flood in the last 500 years. It was good for tourists. You can see they can move around in a boat, but not so much for people living there. And by this point, you might want to think about adaptation to extreme events. So extreme events are characterized by rarity and severity. They are rare, but it doesn't mean that they never happen. So some species have probably evolved some adaptation in response to extreme events. And I want to describe briefly two classes of adaptation. The first one is evasion. This is a photo from Pakistan. In 2010, there were huge floods in Pakistan. What they observed is the spiders were moving away from the ground that was covered by water, and they climbed onto the trees, which were covered in silk. So it's typically a evasive strategy. So they're moving away from extreme events. So the extreme events at this point is a meteorological event, but the consequences on the species is not that extreme. The same thing happened also in New South Wales in Australia in 2012. But now, certain species cannot move. One typical example are plants. But there are adaptations there too. This is a pine forest catching fire. After a few years, it's typically a pine forest to have a regrowth, which is fast and quite dramatic. How does that happen? Because the seeds on the ground are burned by the fire. Well, it happens because there is an adaptation, which is called serotonin, by which cones, after seed maturation, stay closed. And they just open up after the fire. In fact, the resin keeping the cone shut down melts. The seeds can fall into the ground after the fire, and the forest can regrow after just a few years. You may wonder at this point why I'm using as a model system marble trout. So there are other events and other species that have evolved responses, adaptive responses, but so why I chose marble trout? Well, the most important thing is that when you've got extreme events, we need to have replication. If you've got just one extreme event, and we've got certain individual passing through a population bottleneck and the population reforming, we don't know if there was chance or an actual adaptation. How can we tease apart the effects of luck or effect or a functional adaptation if you've got just one single event? Well, in this case, you get about more than 10 floods happening in the last 20 years after the start of the conservation project. So that means that we're able to tease apart the effect of chance to the effect of adaptation. The other thing is that we're able to sample more than 6,000 fish, taking also a piece of tissue for DNA analysis, and it will become pretty important. We'll describe it real soon. Now, if you look at the external characteristic of a species, or a fish in particular in this case, we can also measure weight, size, shape, so we can make consideration between before and after, also all in terms of these crude characteristics. They, of course, describe just a minority of the vast diversity that we can observe between individuals living in the same population. But part of the diversity is coded in the DNA of the individuals. The problem is, up to a few years ago, it was basically impossible, money-wise, to study the DNA at this scale of non-model organisms. That means organisms that are not typically used for experimental work. But with the advent of next-generation sequences in 2007, we observed a huge drop in the cost of DNA sequencing, making it possible to study the DNA also of non-model organisms. Just to make an example here, we've got to sequence the human genome in 2001, we spent $100 million. And right now, we are getting closer and closer to the 1,000 genome. We probably reach that critical psychological threshold in the next 3 to 5 years. The huge drop-off that you observed in 2007 was due to the advent of this next generation sequencing technology. Now, what happens is that you can see, not very much here, is that the different color at this point represents some differences in the characteristics that can be seen through DNA analysis. Now, by looking at specific traits for which we've got theoretical expectation, we can see if there was chance, like on the right, in passing through the bottleneck, or certain value of that trait were basically giving an advantage to individuals. Now, by looking at the DNA of the species combined with theoretical expectation and to our huge sampling experiment, we're able to answer to these three critical questions. The first one is passing through the bottleneck. Are the most fit individuals or is just chance? And are the survival of the most fit individuals in terms of passing through the bottleneck and in terms of reproductive success after the bottleneck itself? And will the species survive a more extreme world? Well, I want to conclude with one thing, that what we'll acquire here in terms of development of new statistical methods, DNA analysis, especially related to model organisms, will be used by other scientists to understand the consequences of extreme events on a range of different contexts, species, and timescales. Thank you. I want to conclude with Santa Cruz 2014, a beautiful environment where, yes, where I work right now.